Hi, my name is Jake Kim, and today I want to talk to you about motivation and discernment. I don't know about you, but I am an easily inspired person. But if I'm honest, that inspiration doesn't always linger for a long time. I've always thought that in the parable of the sower, I am the soil where the seed puts down roots quickly and it grows quickly, but the roots don't go deep. And then when the heat of the sun comes, it burns it up. And I want to talk to you about some things that have been helpful for that. But first, I want to try to inspire you with something that inspired me. There's an author, Eugene Peterson, and he was writing a book about one of the Old Testament prophets. And this is a line from the book. Life is difficult. Are you going to quit at the first wave of opposition? Are you going to retreat when you find that there is more to life than finding 3 meals a day and a dry place to sleep at night? Are you going to run home the minute you find that the mass of men and women are more interested in keeping their feet warm than in living at the risk to the glory of God? Are you going to live cautiously or courageously? I called you to live at your best, to pursue righteousness, to sustain a drive toward excellence. It is easier, I know, to be neurotic. It is easier to be parasitic. It is easier to relax in the embracing arms of the average. Easier, but not better. Easier, but not more significant. Easier, but not more fulfilling. I've called you to a life of purpose far beyond what you think you're capable of living and promised you adequate strength to fulfill your destiny. What is it you really want? Do you want to shuffle along with this crowd or run with the horses? Now, there's a lot in that quote that inspires me and moves me, but a line toward the end is, what do you really want? This is the exact same question that Jesus seems to ask regularly. And I mean, just imagine it being asked to you. What do you really want? What do you really want? And I think if we're honest, we're not always proud of the answer, but what if underneath that more surface desire that we have, there's a desire for something that's actually very, very good? See, I hold out hope for that because I'm with St. Thomas Aquinas when he says that the core of all our desire is for something good because we're made for good and we know it, but sometimes we get confused about what will actually be good for us. And see, we hear these inspiring things to try to draw us back to ourselves. And again, I love being inspired, but the dilemma is the inspiration doesn't linger. I can read a quote like this and it can inspire me for a day maybe or a week even. That'd be pretty good, but often it inspires me for a few moments. And I might make some good decisions in those few moments and that's awesome, but what are some practical things I can do when the desire fades? I think one thing is to continue to read things like this. I think that's what's supposed to be happening in our everyday prayer life. I think another thing that's very important is to decide what we're all about so that we don't have to keep making the same decision over and over when situations repeat themselves. We do that. We try to think through things every single time they arise instead of making some larger decisions, some decisions that are based on larger principles and values, and then we apply those values in our lives. That's a way better way to live. I think that's the way that Jesus invites us to live as disciples. What about when our motivation fades? Or what about when we think it's a good motivation, but we aren't sure? How do we know if it comes from God? This is where the discernment of spirits is absolutely a lifesaver. I'm going to show you a chart, and this chart is something that I put together that's based on St. Ignatius of Loyola's teaching on the discernment of spirits that have been popularized by Father Timothy Gallagher. I've had the privilege of getting to know Father Timothy, and I put together this chart and ran it by him, and he said, it makes sense, it's accurate. So that was helpful for me to even be able to talk about it or apply it in my life. Let's take a look at this chart because I think it could be really helpful to understanding where is this movement or motivation or discouragement coming from and what do we do with it. It's based on the 14 rules of discernment, the first set of rules. So if you look at the chart, you'll notice that it's a matrix. It has 2 columns going up and down and 2 rows going left and right. The 2 columns, the up and down part, are the actions of the two spirits. And we're talking about the good spirit and the evil spirit. And then the two rows are the regular direction of my life. Am I moving away from God and towards serious sin regularly? Or am I moving away from sin and toward God regularly? So let's talk about those, the action of the two spirits. So when we talk about the good spirit, it's any person or force. And I know force might sound weird, it's not Star Wars, but it's any kind of person or pull or movement, natural or supernatural, that leads us toward God. That is what the good spirit is. So it could be a person, it could be an experience, it could actually be an angel, it could be God himself. All of those are included in what Ignatius talks about with the good spirit. Now, the evil spirit is the opposite of that. It's any person and or force, natural or supernatural, that leads us away from God. Now, that could be an actual demon, which would be a more specific example of an evil spirit. It could be a person. It could be all kinds of various things. All of those are put together in what is the evil spirit. And obviously, we want to avoid evil and do good. And so the next categories are the rows, and that's the general direction of my life, moving away from God and toward serious sin, or moving away from sin and toward God. And as I read this, I was regularly confused in this category because I thought that I had to live a perfect life for me to be in the category that's away from sin and toward God. And Father Timothy helped me realize that people who are pursuing God, they're in that second category. People who show up to talks are in that second category of moving away from sin and toward God. So wherever we find ourselves, now we can look at the overlay between the rows and the columns and start to get a sense of what the good spirit does and the evil spirit does based on the direction of our life. And this is where it starts to get really helpful, because now we know, is this something I should listen to or not listen to? And so what the good spirit does when we are moving away from God and towards sin is stings the conscience through truth, reason, and stirs up holy distress. Now, what this actually means is our heart is questioning and doesn't have peace. There's disruption when we're doing something that's bad. See, God's trying to draw us back to himself by helping us see through truth and reason, is this actually good for you? Are you actually going to be satisfied with this? Is doing that thing one more time actually going to make you happy? And we're irritated by that. That's often the action of the good spirit. Now, the evil spirit, when we're moving away from God and towards serious sin, continues to propose the apparent pleasures and fuels the imagination toward idols. That's just powerful language. Proposing apparent pleasures. Won't this be so good? It'll be great. You'll love it. It'll be the best. It'll feel so good. And fuels the imagination toward idols. We've all had our mind wander, maybe in a fantasy or maybe in just thinking about something. And when our mind wanders away toward idols, if we're moving away from God and toward serious sin, that's the evil spirit. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire that shouldn't be there. It's trying to cause this thing, us to move further away from God by continuing to worship things that aren't actually good for us. Now let's go to the category of people who are moving toward God and away from sin. Now, this is really, really exciting because I think most of us, me included, continually struggle with thinking that when God corrects us, even when we're trying to be in a relationship with him, I think a lot of us think that he'll do it in a harsh way. And this is where the discernment of spirits are so helpful. Let's look at it. The good spirit, when we're moving away from sin and toward God, encourages, strengthens, consoles, inspires, brings about tears because of sin or love of God, removes and eases perceived obstacles, and here's the big one, brings peace. I think a lot of us think that when we're in a relationship with God, God scolds us, gets upset with us, shames us, tells us to get it together, that we think that's the action of the good spirit. And what St. Ignatius is saying is, no, that's not. That is not what the good spirit does. The good spirit encourages, strengthens, consoles, inspires. This is so helpful when we are trying to make a decision, when we think something's motivating us and we're not sure whether to follow it, or if we've lost that motivation and we're not sure what to do next and we have these ideas and thoughts coming into our mind, we know that the good spirit will encourage us, will strengthen us, console us. Now let's look at what the evil spirit does for people who are moving away from sin and toward God. The evil spirit distresses, claws away at peace, saddens with disheartening suggestions, proposes obstacles with negative or untrue thoughts. I don't know about you, but this happens to me regularly, where I have distress or something that's clawing away at peace or sadness with disheartening suggestions. Now, this happens to us all the time. The evil spirit is active. And so, no matter what situation you're in, whether you're motivated or not motivated, these good and evil spirits are active. And the evil spirit is proposing obstacles with negativity, untrue thoughts, bringing about distress, taking away peace, saddening, disheartening. I think often we think that those movements are good. And what a ploy of the enemy to convince us that what is bad is good, to convince us that what is evil is good. What a deception. It's diabolical. It's coming from, ultimately, the father of lies. So spending some time with this chart can be really helpful in the discernment of our hearts as we are moving about in life, especially when things aren't going well, especially when we're distressed, especially when things are a struggle. Now, one thing I think that's important to distinguish that Father Timothy really helped me understand was the difference between spiritual consolation or desolation and psychological consolation or desolation. The spiritual is in relation to God, moving toward God or away from God. That's the primary context. Psychological isn't necessarily about God. And that distinction is very important, especially when you're using the first set of rules, because on the natural level or the psychological level, some of the rules don't apply. Because, for example, if you're in intense depression or sadness, you should make a change in your life. That'd be rule 5. But in spiritual desolation, you shouldn't make a change, for example, in your daily prayer routine. But psychological desolation, you should make a change. See a therapist, talk to a friend, do something different. That distinction is very important. However, psychological desolation and consolation can and often is a springboard into spiritual consolation or desolation. It's not that they're always separate, but we just have to understand the distinction to apply the rules well. This chart, though, is kind of a summary of the first 2 rules. And I find it very helpful to understand who's talking to me right now and who's trying to move me in one direction or another. I hope that this blessed you, and we'll talk again soon.